Russia should be the first country to join NATO. These are the words of recently declassified documents from the United States National Security Archive. They were spoken in January 1994 by the first president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin. At that time, he personally welcomed his American colleague, Bill Clinton, in Moscow and shared his vision for life after the collapse of the USSR at the dacha in Novo-Ogaryovo. First, Russia would join NATO, and only then could other Central and Eastern European countries join. There should be a sort of cartel between the USA, Russia, and Europeans to foster and strengthen international security. But 30 years later, international security looks different. Millions of soldiers are once again at war in Europe. Russia is still not in NATO, but the Central and Eastern European countries have indeed joined the largest, most powerful, and wealthiest military alliance in history, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. There are now 32 countries with a combined population of nearly 1 billion people, military expenditures exceeding $1 trillion, and the largest stockpiles of weapons on Earth. Why did NATO come into being? How did this alliance develop? And why did the Soviet Union officially want to join it? And then the new Russia, but this never happened, on March 54th. This is how Europe looks in the midst of the Cold War. In the East, communist countries led by the Soviet Union. In the West, capitalist countries, led by the richest country in the world, the United States of America. It is important to note that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, uniting 14 countries, has been functioning effectively for 5 years. But pay attention, in the very center of the continent lies the divided Germany, split into 2 parts, and its western part is not yet part of NATO. However, Turkey and Greece have already been accepted into the alliance, bringing it closer to the borders of the USSR and countries under Moscow's influence. Now, let's move east. Just recently, the Korean War ended here with a temporary ceasefire. In it, the Soviet Union, along with China and Kim Il-sung, fought against the United States and its NATO allies. This conflict took place very close to Soviet territory. At the same time, the superpowers are actively producing thousands of nuclear warheads and secretly preparing various military defense and attack plans against each other. That is, the situation in the world is extremely unstable. And then, in March of the 54th, the Soviet leadership proposes to the governments of France, Great Britain, and the United States to sign a joint pan-European treaty on collective security. The Soviet Union sends an application to NATO to join the organization. Very unexpected, huh? But in fact, the USSR wants to understand, if you are not against us, or as it is written in your charter, are resolved to unite their efforts for collective defense and for the preservation of peace and security, then accept us into the alliance, and if not, then everything is clear with you. The government of the USSR did not share, nor can it today, the view that this treaty is defensive. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization could lose its aggressive character. That is, if all the big powers which belonged to the anti-Hitler coalition became its participants. The Soviet government states its readiness to join with the interested governments in examining the matter of having the Soviet Union participate in the North Atlantic Treaty. But in the end, West Germany was accepted into NATO. In response, the USSR immediately created its own military bloc, the Warsaw Pact. In 61st, the confrontation between the systems will reach the Berlin crisis, when the famous wall will divide the capital of Germany. And in 62nd, when the Americans will place their missiles in Turkey, and the USSR wants to do the same in Cuba, the world almost ends in a real nuclear war. Obviously, the Soviet Union could never be in NATO. What is called by origin? Why? Because this military alliance was created in 1949 specifically to counter the communist threat. Imagine Europe right after World War II. At that time, the most powerful army in the world, the Red Army, controlled almost the entire eastern part of the continent. For Western politicians, the main fear was that Soviet forces would not stop at Berlin, Vienna, and Prague, but would continue moving westward. Here's what British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote. First, Soviet Russia has become a deadly threat to the free world. Second, we must immediately create a new front against its rapid advance. Third, this front in Europe should extend as far east as possible. Therefore, in the spring of 1945, he instructed his military strategists to develop 2 secret plans under the code name Unthinkable. One option was to attack the Soviet Union themselves and push the Red Army back to its own borders. The second was a defensive plan in case Stalin decided to spread communism all the way to the English Channel. However, British analysts reported grim prospects to Churchill. According to them, the Allies can only send 103 Anglo-American divisions into battle. But that's a lot, you say. It seems so. But against them, the USSR would then have 264, of which 34 armored divisions. The Soviet Union had more airplanes as well. In general, the final conclusion is this: when starting a war with the Russians, one must be prepared for a prolonged, costly, total war. Their numerical superiority on land makes the possibility of achieving limited and rapid military success extremely doubtful. But if we don't have the strength to fight them head-on, how do we contain the communists? There are two options: the carrot and the stick. Gingerbread is a famous Marshall Plan. Americans send $12 billion in aid to post-war Europe. It is interesting that Europeans mostly have to buy American goods with this money. It turns out to be some kind of voluntary compulsory injustice. But there is another unofficial condition set by the USA. All countries receiving aid had better keep the communists out of their governments as far as possible. This was particularly important to do in France and Italy, where the red guys immediately after the war gained a lot of votes. What then is meant by the whip? Scare people with the communist threat to the maximum and cut off Western countries from Soviet influence and propaganda. An iron curtain descended across the continent from Szczecin on the Baltic to Trieste on the Adriatic. Behind this line are all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities I must call the Soviet sphere. The logic is clear. It is not possible to forcibly take over Eastern Europe right away, and Russia, which has just experienced the bloodiest attack in history, plans to give nothing away. Because for the USSR, it is a matter of security. The more land you have, the more strategic depth and opportunities you have to repel someone's potential attack. Moreover, the Americans already have an atomic bomb, and they are developing a plan called Drop Shot. According to this plan, they plan to drop 300 nuclear and 29,000 incendiary bombs on 100 Soviet cities from airplanes, and then armies are also preparing to advance on all fronts. In this case, who will be giving up the territories where all of this will go? But Western democracies are also worried about this. For example, in 1948, the KGB supported a coup in Czechoslovakia, and instead of a coalition government with representatives from all parties, power in Prague was taken by communists and ministers who were extremely friendly to them. If in 1945 there were only 40,000 members of the Communist Party in the country, by 1948 there were already 1,350,000. This is because Moscow cannot do without Czechoslovakia. There is uranium in this country for the first Soviet nuclear bomb and future nuclear energy. The first Soviet RDS-1 will be made of 60% German uranium, 20% Czech uranium, 3% Polish uranium, and only the remainder from the USSR itself. In that same year, 1948, the USSR will also block West Berlin, and the United States, along with the British, will deliver food there only by air. As a result, the conflict will definitively split occupied Germany, and in 1949, the former anti-Hitler allies will officially divide it into two states, the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. The new American President Truman will inform the world how the United States will conduct itself by containing the Soviet Union wherever possible and supporting democratic forces and regimes around the globe. Today, this is known as the Truman Doctrine, and it was under this doctrine that NATO was established in 1949. Why did Western Europe need this alliance? Look, a year before its creation, 5 European countries had signed the so-called Brussels Pact, a secret agreement on collective self-defense. Even together, however, this group could do little against the military might of the USSR. They needed the Americans. The United States adopts the Vandenberg Resolution, which allows it to do two important things. First, they can enter and form military alliances even in peacetime. And second, they can place their bases in independent states. Today, the map of independent countries with U.S. military bases is as follows. The largest number of bases are in Germany, Britain, and Japan. But why does the U.S. itself need NATO if they will be the primary sponsor of its defense throughout history? Let us turn to two documents. The first is the long telegram by American diplomat George Kennan, who is considered one of the architects of the Cold War. In this memo, he explains in detail to his government what Soviet Russia is and why Russians have historically felt unprotected, and how local rulers constantly use this fear to expand their territories. Why should we fear the USSR and how do we fight it? Russians will strive energetically to develop Soviet representation in and official ties with countries in which they sense strong possibilities of opposition to Western centers of power. This applies to such widely separated points as Germany, Argentina, and Middle Eastern countries. On unofficial plane, particularly violent efforts will be made to weaken power and influence of Western powers of colonial, backward, or dependent peoples. Resentment among dependent peoples will be stimulated. Think about it. After World War II, the United States objectively has the strongest economy in the world. But how to develop further? They need even more customers, and Europe is hundreds of millions of the most affluent consumers, and NATO is an excellent guarantee not to lose developed Europe and bind it to itself. Now, the second document of the era is a telegram from the Soviet ambassador in Washington. In it, he also explains in detail what the United States itself wants. All countries in Europe and Asia are experiencing a colossal need for consumer goods, industrial and transportation equipment, and so on. This situation opens up the prospect for American monopolistic capital to make enormous deliveries of goods and import capital into these countries, which would allow it to integrate into their national economies. Additionally, Novikov writes that American military expenditures have already increased tenfold and continue to grow. He reports that the states will build 228 bases, support points, and radio stations in the Atlantic Ocean, and 258 in the Pacific Ocean. They agree with Great Britain to divide the world. The US gets the Far East, Japan and China, while the British operate in India, Siam and Indonesia. The final conclusion is as follows. The United States is preparing for a future war with the expectation that it will be waged against the Soviet Union, which in the eyes of the American imperialists is the main obstacle to world domination. In fact, this is the case. Throughout the Cold War, both sides have been preparing Europe for World War III. For example, look at this map of nuclear charges on the border between West and East Germany. These are relatively small charges, similar to a soldier's satchel, and the Americans plan to place them in the ground, in water, and under bridges to stop the Soviet advance. Now, I hope you understand how and why the world will divide, and NATO will become the main military tool for containing the USSR in Europe. Or as the famous phrase attributed to the first Secretary General of the Alliance Ismay goes, keep the Russians out of Europe, the Americans in Europe, and the Germans under control. This captures the essence of NATO in one sentence. But the most important thing that the alliance gives to all its members is Article 5 of the Charter. If someone attacks one NATO member, it is considered an attack on the entire bloc. For smaller countries like Luxembourg, Estonia, or Montenegro, this today guarantees that, if anything happens, such a huge power as the USA will stand up for their interests. For the USA itself, the fifth article is important, because the American president can act without consulting Congress and can use military force, as if the states had been attacked. In fact, this article has only been invoked once in the entire history of the bloc, and that was when terrorists attacked the Twin Towers in New York in 2001. After that, NATO forces jointly entered Afghanistan.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
And so, after 1991, your main enemy is no longer there. What remains of him humbly asks for help and money.
Господи, благослови Америку.
And you have military potential for a full-scale nuclear war. But you can't just abandon something that has been created for decades. In addition, a number of countries are lining up to join the North Atlantic Alliance, seeking to become part of the main military force in the world. Note how and how many times NATO has expanded. The first expansion occurs in 1952. Greece and Turkey join the alliance. The second time is in 1955, West Germany. It's only almost 30 years later that Spain will join, as it becomes a democracy, having rid itself of General Franco's dictatorship. Now, watch what an influx will happen after 1999. NATO will admit as many countries as it had before, 16 if you don't count France's return. Why such a rush? If the main world evil called the Soviet Union no longer existed, and Russia could not even cope with the then rebellious Chechnya. Let's examine this graph of military expenditures by states from 1950 to the present. What is noticeable? The USSR spends a lot of money on armaments, and at some point cannot keep up with this arms race and collapses. But it's obvious that at that moment others are not deflating as quickly. You might say, well, look, the states in other NATO countries are starting to spend less on the military and reduce their troops in Europe. Yes, but this less is nothing to compare with Russia or China. From around 2002, American spending begins to grow, and today it is even higher than during the Cold War. So, the North Atlantic Treaty will not only not disappear due to lack of necessity, but will become even more needed, larger and richer. There is a famous phrase about NATO, or more precisely, the alliance's promise not to expand an inch eastward. For example, Putin speaks about it in his address on February 24, 2022.
обещание нашей стороне не расширять ни на 1 дюйм НАТО на восток.
These words are really not fiction, but a specific quote from the Secretary of State of the United States, James Baker. He said them in 1990 in the Kremlin during documented negotiations with the head of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev. If we maintain a presence in a Germany that is a part of NATO, there would be no extension of NATO's jurisdiction for forces of NATO 1 inch to the east. February 1990. The Germans have already managed to tear down the Berlin Wall, and in the USSR itself, perestroika is underway to the extent that the Union is barely holding together as a single state, and the country is facing serious financial problems. At the same time, there are around 380,000 Soviet soldiers stationed in East Germany, and they need to be supported somehow. Gorbachev is negotiating with the United States about German reunification and the potential withdrawal of both Soviet and American troops from there. The Americans are offering the Soviet leadership 2 options. The first, Germany reunifies and starts living independently, without control. This doesn't suit Gorbachev because he fears that the Germans, like after World War I, will again amass military power and pose a threat to Russia. We don't really want to see a repeat of Versailles, after which the Germans were able to rearm. But the United States has a second option. Germany comes under their control, but they guarantee that NATO will not move further east. And here it is important to clarify what does eastward mean at that time. Look at the map. Here are the NATO countries and here is the Warsaw Pact territory. This includes Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. As of February 1990, as a military alliance, it continues to exist. And no one of course knows that soon, namely on July 1st of the same year, it will cease to exist. Thus, the concept of eastward refers only to the territory of the GDR, East Germany. It is there that NATO promises not to expand an inch. And how could it expand there when Soviet and until 1994, Russian troops are stationed? This is confirmed by Gorbachev himself in a 2014 interview.
Dazu sollte man Folgendes berücksichtigen. Damals existierte die NATO und der Warschauer Pakt. Was sollte man da vertraglich fixieren? Die Frage stellte sich damals gar nicht.
Das heißt, es ist ein Mythos, dass Sie vom Westen bezüglich der NATO-Osterweiterung betrogen wurden?
Ja.
What happens next? On September 12, 1990, the Treaty for the Reunification of Germany is signed in Moscow. Better known as 2+4, this is because it is signed by 2 Germanys, the FRG and the GDR, plus 4 countries providing international guarantees, the USSR, the USA, the United Kingdom, and France. This document contains a lot of interesting points, such as the fact that the USSR will withdraw its troops from the GDR by the end of 1994. But there is an important clause in the treaty: no foreign troops or nuclear weapons will be deployed in all of Germany, specifically in its eastern part. And this condition is still observed today. However, there is not a word in the treaty about NATO not expanding an inch. On the contrary, Article 6 states that the right of a reunified Germany to participate in alliances, along with all the resulting rules and obligations, is not affected by this treaty. This means that the Germans can join any organization without coordinating it with anyone, because according to Article 7, a reunified Germany gains full sovereignty over its internal and external affairs. So in the end, the only ones who could be outraged and ask questions were Gorbachev himself and his team, as they did not secure the potential NATO expansion in an official agreement.
Where is that promise written down?
Да-да-да. Вы молодец.
Right. Well done. Well done. Correct. You've got a point. Nya. Got you good. Well, congratulations. Of course, everything should be sealed and written on paper.
But soon not only the Warsaw Pact will collapse, but also the Soviet Union itself. Each of the new independent countries will primarily think about how to save their own economy. In April 1993, the presidents of 3 former socialist countries, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, will fly to Washington. And here's what Polish leader Lech Walesa says: after decades of Soviet domination, we are all afraid of Russia. It is important to remember that this is the first time in history that the Soviet army has withdrawn from territory peacefully. If Russia again adopts an aggressive foreign policy, that aggression will be directed toward Ukraine and Poland. The United States is needed to prevent this from happening. In fact, Moscow's former allies are asking to join NATO themselves. It is August 1993. Yeltsin goes to Warsaw to meet with the Polish president and surprises everyone. Our country must respect Poland's decision to join NATO because both countries have sovereignty. It is clear that many people in Russia are shocked by this, to put it mildly. And the Poles themselves will joke that Poland owes its accession to NATO to Boris Nikolaevich personally. Remember, I started with documents from 1994. When Yeltsin proposes a scheme to Clinton, let's say you take us, Russia, first, and then everyone else, why won't they? Let's take it in order. First, check out this graphic, who in NATO spends the most money and therefore has the most influence. Now, who has how many troops in the alliance? You could say that almost half of NATO's manpower is American soldiers. And if you look at the main suppliers of weapons in the world, it becomes obvious that 90% of the military potential of the alliance is the capabilities of one particular country, the United States and its Pentagon. The logical question arises, why then should the United States sponsor all this? But one must realize that every new NATO member makes a significant monetary contribution. However, 4% of Poland's GDP is not even close to 3.5% of US GDP. And comparing it to Estonia's 2% is ridiculous. And it's not even about troops. 250 Icelandic or 940 Luxembourgian soldiers won't change anything. Each new country is interesting to the alliance as a source of new territories where something can be placed to weaken the potential power of the enemy. Take Iceland, for example. The Americans will install a SOSUS hydroacoustic system there to detect Soviet submarines, since this is their only access to the Atlantic Ocean. Every member of the alliance has such seemingly modest contributions. For example, the Czech Republic is an ideal location in the center of Europe, connecting the northern part of NATO, Germany and Poland, to the southern part through Slovakia, Hungary, Romania and Bulgaria. This area is ideal for deploying tens of thousands of soldiers in various directions. In addition, a NATO Center for Chemical, Biological and Nuclear Defense will be opened in Wyszowo in 2007. There is nothing criminal in this. During the Warsaw Pact, Czechoslovakia was one of the leaders in this field, and Wyszowo is home to military and training centers focused on biological and nuclear weapons. Poland is also a key country to the east for NATO. It connects the North Atlantic Alliance to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia, through the narrow Suwałki corridor, named for the nearby Polish town of Suwałki. As you can see, this 100-kilometer stretch separates Russia's allied Belarus from Kaliningrad Oblast. Even before Finland joined NATO, these three countries were NATO's main outpost on the Baltic Sea. The current situation effectively turns it into an inland lake of the alliance. This poses a significant threat to the Russian naval bases in Kronstadt and Baltis. What else is important? In 2008, NATO will open a cybersecurity center in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. Why there? Because Estonia is one of the earliest countries in Europe to embrace the internet. In 2003, they invented Skype. In 2005, local authorities organized re-electronic voting, and in 2007, they introduced mobile ID cards. In general, it is a great country in close proximity to a potential enemy, where there are many specialists and technologies to prepare for cyber warfare, where you need to be able to both defend your infrastructure and attack the enemy's infrastructure, disrupt water supplies, power plants, and even military commanders. So any new country in the alliance is not a percentage of GDP and troops, but the territories themselves and unique services. These countries themselves wanted to join the alliance because by themselves they do not represent any military power, and Russia, even in its most shaken and sluggish state, would never be there. Well, what if, purely theoretically, we add a huge Russian army and a considerable military budget to the NATO cauldron? Within the organization, a new notable center of power immediately emerges, which of course will require attention. And in the long term, it may even lead to a split of the bloc. If we go back to those very conversations between Yeltsin and Clinton in early '94, it was that year that decided a lot of things. It was then that NATO signed the first partnership for peace agreements with the countries of the former Soviet bloc. At the end of 1994, the Russian army started fighting in Chechnya and was not going to let the rebellious republic go. Such a turnaround, on the one hand, frightens neighboring countries by showing them that Russia is taking up arms again. On the other hand, it shows NATO, why do we need these Russians if they can't even cope with their own guerrillas? I will draw your attention to the very George Kennan who, back in 1946, mapped out the future Cold War. But back in 1998, before the first post-Soviet expansion of NATO, he predicted the following. I think it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to react to it and tell your friends. See you in the future.